The deadbolt clicked. I was locked in my childhood bedroom. Outside, police sirens wailed. My mother was weeping to a 911 dispatcher, claiming I was violently insane. She was desperate to lock me in a psychiatric ward tonight. The real reason, she needed to silence me before I exposed the $45,000 of fraudulent debt she opened in my name. When those officers breached my door, my parents thought my life was over. They were wrong. My name is Nina. Hit like and subscribe to Sweet Life Drama if you have ever survived a toxic family member playing the victim. Before I continue, drop a comment with your age and where you are watching from. Trust me, you will not believe how I turned their fake medical emergency into a federal indictment. The wooden frame of my bedroom door splintered inward with a deafening crack. Two officers surged through the broken threshold. The first one had his taser drawn and leveled at my chest. The red laser sight danced erratically across the fabric of my shirt. The second officer flanked him, his hand resting on the grip of his holstered firearm. Behind them, the narrow hallway was choked with the bulky medical bags and reflective jackets of two paramedics. The air in the room suddenly smelled of sweat, adrenaline, and cracked pine. They expected a monster. They expected a frantic, unhinged woman tearing the room apart. Instead, they found me sitting on the edge of my twin bed. Underneath the oversized hem of my sweater, my fingernails were digging so deeply into my own thighs that I knew I would leave bruises. My chest burned with a primal, suffocating panic, every instinct screaming at me to fight or run. But I forced my spine to lock perfectly straight. I swallowed the thick knot of terror in my throat. I unclenched my fists 1 agonizing millimeter at a time, turning my palms upward and resting them on my knees until my fingers stopped trembling. I forced my breathing into a slow, mechanical rhythm, counting the seconds in my head. In any encounter with law enforcement during a reported mental health crisis, panic is a liability, and sudden movements are a death sentence. "Show me your hands," the lead officer barked. His voice was tight, carrying the high pitch of a man ready for a physical altercation. "My hands are empty and visible," I said. I kept my tone low, flat, and entirely conversational. "I am unarmed. I am not experiencing a medical emergency." The officer with the taser lowered the weapon a fraction of an inch. His eyes darted around the room, scanning the neatly folded laundry on my desk, the undisturbed bookshelves, the stack of credit card statements resting beside me. The scene did not match the dispatch report. Before he could process the discrepancy, my mother made her entrance. Helen pushed her way past the paramedics, stumbling into the room with the clumsy desperation of a woman fleeing a fire. She collapsed onto her knees right at the foot of my bed. She reached out, gripping the hem of the officer's uniform trousers. Tears streamed down her face, ruining her makeup in perfect photogenic streaks. Her breathing came in ragged, hyperventilating gasps. "Thank God you are here," Helen sobbed, her voice trembling. "She is out of her mind. She is hallucinating." "Please do not hurt her. She just does not know what she is doing." The younger officer immediately knelt beside my mother, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Helen leaned into his touch, playing the fragile, traumatized matriarch to perfection. "Ma'am, you need to step back into the hallway," the older officer said, though his tone had already softened with pity. Helen shook her head wildly. "I cannot leave her. She tried to kill him." She grabbed the carving knife from the kitchen island. She was swinging it at her father. She said she saw demons. I looked past the officers, past my weeping mother, and found my father standing in the hallway. Richard hovered near the doorframe, a shadow in his own home. He wore his favorite faded denim jacket, his hands shoved deep into the pockets. He refused to meet my eyes. He stared intently at the scuff marks on the hardwood floor. His jaw muscles twitched. Richard was not afraid of me. He was afraid of the men holding his markers at the underground poker tables across state lines. The $45,000 in casino debt was a noose tightening around his neck. Helen had offered him a way out. She opened the credit lines in my name, and all he had to do was provide the silent corroboration for her lies. His silence bought him time. He shifted his weight from his left foot to his right, playing the part of the shell-shocked husband, letting his wife's theatrics carry the weight of the fraud.
"Did you threaten your father with a knife tonight?"
The lead officer asked me. His grip on the taser tightened again. "No," I replied, keeping my eyes locked on the officer. There was no knife. There was no argument. My mother locked me in this room and dialed 911 because I discovered she stole my identity. Helen let out a sharp, wounded wail. Listen to her. The paranoia is getting worse. She thinks everyone is stealing from her. She has been up for 3 days straight. Please, you have to sedate her before she hurts someone. I ignored Helen. Arguing with a manipulator in front of an audience only feeds their narrative. I turned my attention to the paramedic standing just inside the door. "Sir," I said to the medic, "a manic episode involving sleep deprivation, paranoia, and violent outbursts would trigger a sudden spike in cortisol and adrenaline. My heart rate would be elevated. My pupils would be dilated. I am offering you my wrist. Check my vitals right now." The paramedic stepped forward, a glimmer of professional curiosity cutting through the tension. He reached out and wrapped 2 fingers around my wrist, finding my radial artery. He pulled a small penlight from his breast pocket and clicked it on. "Look straight ahead," he instructed. I held my eyes wide open. The bright beam swept across my vision. The room fell silent, except for the harsh sound of my mother pretending to hyperventilate. The paramedic clicked his light off. He looked at his watch, counting my pulse. After 10 seconds, he let go of my wrist. He turned to the police officer. "Her pulse is 72 beats per minute," the paramedic stated. "Pupils are responsive and normal. Skin is dry and cool. There are no physical signs of acute agitation or chemical imbalance." The lead officer frowned. He holstered his taser and looked down at Helen. The narrative was falling apart. The physical evidence did not support the hysterical phone call. Helen recognized the shift in the room. The weeping mother routine was losing its effectiveness. She needed a trump card, and she had prepared one in advance. She scrambled to her feet, brushing imaginary dust from her skirt. She reached into the pocket of her cardigan and retrieved a folded piece of heavy stock paper. "She is a sociopath," Helen whispered, her voice suddenly dropping an octave, taking on a tone of desperate confidentiality. "She knows how to hide it. Our family doctor warned us this would happen. He examined her this afternoon. He said she is a danger to herself and to us." Helen thrust the paper into the older officer's hand. I recognized the letterhead even from a few feet away. Dr. Aris Thorne, a private psychiatrist who played golf with my father and attended the same country club as my mother. He had not treated me since I was a teenager struggling with test anxiety. Helen had somehow convinced him, or perhaps paid him, to sign a formal psychiatric hold document without ever laying eyes on me. The officer unfolded the paper. His eyes tracked down the page, scanning the medical jargon and the legal citations. In the state system, this document was a direct order. It was a 1013 form, a legal mechanism that stripped a person of their autonomy and mandated an involuntary 72-hour psychiatric evaluation. The officer's demeanor changed instantly. The skepticism vanished, replaced by the rigid protocol of the law. A signed medical order superseded a normal pulse and a calm demeanor. "Miss," the officer said, folding the paper and tucking it into his vest. "I am sorry, but this is a valid medical directive. We have to transport you to the emergency receiving facility for evaluation." "That document is fraudulent," I stated clearly. "I have not seen Dr. Thorne in 10 years. Helen let out another sob, burying her face in her hands. "Please do not let her manipulate you. Just take her to the hospital where she can be safe." The younger officer unclipped the handcuffs from his belt. The metallic rattle echoed off the bare walls of my bedroom. "Stand up and turn around," he commanded. "Place your hands behind your back. You are not under arrest, but department policy requires restraints during an involuntary medical transport." This was a breaking point. This was the moment Helen expected me to snap. She wanted me to scream, to fight the officers, to resist the handcuffs. Any physical resistance would instantly validate the narrative that I was out of control. It would give them a reason to add criminal charges to the medical hold. It would cement my status as a danger to society. I stood up slowly. I smoothed the wrinkles out of my dark slacks. I turned my back to the officers and placed my wrists together behind my waist. The cold steel clamped down on my skin. The ratcheting sound of the cuffs locking into place made my father flinch in the hallway. He finally looked up, his eyes meeting mine in the reflection of the vanity mirror. I held his gaze. I offered him no absolution. "I will cooperate fully," I said to the officers. I needed them to take me out of this house. The moment I crossed the threshold of a sterile hospital, Helen's influence would end. She could buy a forged signature from a country club doctor, but she could not bribe an entire emergency room staff. A hospital meant an independent medical evaluation. It meant a clean record. It meant the trap I had set with the recording device was about to spring shut on a federal level. The officers guided me by the arms toward the bedroom door. I walked past Helen, who was wiping her eyes with a tissue, already adopting the brave face of a mother enduring a tragedy. I walked past Richard, who shrank back against the wallpaper to give me a wide berth. We descended the stairs. The front door stood wide open, letting in the chill of the night air. The neighborhood was awake. Porch lights burned bright across the street. The flashing emergency lights from the cruiser and the ambulance painted the manicured lawns in harsh red and blue strokes. I stepped out onto the driveway. The paramedics opened the rear doors of the ambulance. I climbed inside and took my seat on the vinyl bench. The younger officer followed, securing the end of my handcuffs to a metal rail bolted to the wall. The doors slammed shut, sealing me inside the box of the rig. The siren activated, a piercing wail that vibrated through the metal walls of the ambulance. The younger officer sat across from me, his hand resting near his radio, watching me with a mixture of caution and lingering doubt. The paramedic busied himself with a blood pressure cuff, though he did not attempt to put it on me. The heavy tires rumbled over the suburban asphalt, taking me further away from the prison of my childhood bedroom. I leaned my head back against the cold wall of the rig. The trap was set. Now, I just needed to make one phone call. The rig swayed hard to the right as it navigated a sharp turn. The metal handrail running along the ceiling rattled against the steel cuff securing my left wrist. The younger police officer sat on the jump seat near the rear doors. His posture was rigid. He kept his hand resting lightly on his duty belt, his eyes locked on my face, waiting for the anticipated delusion to kick in. The paramedic sat across from him, pulling a blood pressure cuff from a canvas bag. He looked at me, looked at the officer, and decided to leave the cuff in his lap. Nobody wanted to provoke the supposedly manic patient. I sat upright on the vinyl bench. I matched my breathing to the rhythm of the heavy tires hitting the pavement joints. In, out, controlled. Every second I remained calm was another crack in my mother's story. My right hand was restricted by the chain, but free enough to reach the face of my Apple Watch. I tilted my wrist. The small square screen illuminated the dim cabin. I lifted my chin toward the microphone. "Hey Siri, call Julian." The officer leaned forward, his boots squeaking on the rubber floor mat.
Miss, who are you contacting?
"My family," I said, not looking at him. My voice was stripped of all emotion, a pure, flat broadcast. The watch chimed. The dial tone echoed in the tight space. Julian picked up on the second ring. Julian was my sister Chloe's husband. He was a black man standing 6'2", possessing a degree in applied mathematics and a mind that processed human behavior through the exact same lens he used for risk assessment. As a senior credit risk analyst for Bank of America, his career was built on identifying inconsistencies, tracking digital footprints, and flagging fraud. Helen hated him with a burning, unspoken intensity. She hated him because her southern charm and manufactured tears held zero currency with him. 2 Thanksgivings ago, she tried to guilt Chloe into paying for a family cruise by crying at the dinner table. Julian had calmly pulled out his phone, opened the calculator app, itemized Helen's discretionary spending over the past 6 months, and slid the screen across the table. He never raised his voice, he just presented the data. Helen left the room and did not speak to him for a year. He was the one person in my family's orbit who could not be bought, bullied, or manipulated. "Nina?" Julian's voice filled the ambulance, rich and steady, cutting right through the wail of the siren.
Julian,
I said. They executed a 1013 order. I am in the back of a rig heading to General Hospital right now. The paramedic stopped tapping his pen. He exchanged a sharp glance with the police officer. A patient in the middle of a violent psychotic break does not recite legal hold codes into a smartwatch with the cadence of a corporate attorney. Are you secured? Julian asked. Handcuffed to the wall rail, I replied. Helen produced a forged medical directive from Dr. Thorne. She is pushing for an emergency conservatorship to gain control of the accounts. Lock everything down. Julian did not waste time asking how I felt. He did not offer empty comfort. He delivered logistics. Using the login credentials you gave me, I accessed the device history for all 5 credit accounts 10 minutes ago, he said. The IP location pings for the fraudulent applications matched the router in your parents' living room. The spending timestamps align perfectly with Richard's flight to Vegas last month. I am grabbing the physical files and my briefcase now. I will meet you at the receiving bay. Do not engage them until I am in a secure room, I said. Understood. The call disconnected. The silence in the ambulance felt heavier now. The officer stared at my wrist. The paramedic stared at his clipboard. The narrative Helen had so carefully constructed on my front lawn was beginning to rot right in front of them. The ambulance slowed, taking the sharp turn into the hospital complex. The siren cut off abruptly, leaving my ears ringing. The vehicle lurched backward into the emergency receiving bay. The rear doors swung outward, flooding the dim cabin with the stark blue-white glare of the hospital overhang. The officer unclipped the metal ring from the wall rail. He guided my arms down and reattached the cuff to my right wrist, securing my hands together in front of my waist. Standard operating procedure for an involuntary mental health transport. You do not get to walk in with free hands. I stepped down onto the concrete. The sliding glass doors of the emergency room parted with a mechanical hiss. The triage area smelled of industrial floor cleaner and stale coffee. 3 nurses stood behind a high elevated counter. A security guard in a dark uniform leaned against a pillar near the metal detectors. The officer guided me by the elbow toward the intake desk. The lead triage nurse looked up from her dual monitors. Her eyes tracked the police uniform, moved down to the steel cuffs around my wrists, and finally rested on my face. Her expression immediately shifted into that guarded, patronizing pity reserved for the unstable. She softened her features, adopting the tone of voice people use to soothe a frightened animal. "All right, sweetheart," she cooed, typing something into her keyboard. "We're going to get you into a safe room so the doctor can come have a nice chat with you." "I need an independent evaluation by the attending psychiatrist," I said. My voice was clear and unhurried. "The paperwork the officers were given is fraudulent. I am not experiencing a crisis." The nurse offered a tight, professional smile that did not reach her eyes. "Of course, honey. We will take care of everything. Just stand right there for me." Before the police officer could hand over his report, the main sliding glass doors hissed open again. Helen swept into the waiting room. Richard trailed a few paces behind her, keeping his head down, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. Helen did not approach the reception desk. She locked her eyes on me and marched straight across the waiting area. She had used the car ride to perfect her presentation. Her eyes were bloodshot. Her breathing was ragged and loud. She played to the gallery the moment she crossed the threshold. The nurses behind the counter stopped typing. The security guard straightened his posture. 2 other patients in the waiting area looked up from their phones. "My baby!" Helen cried out, reaching her hands toward my face. "Oh, look what they had to do to you. This is tearing me apart." I took half a step backward, putting distance between us. "Keep your hands off me, Helen." She stopped. Her gaze dropped from my face to my chest. A silver teardrop pendant rested flush against my collarbone. The red recording indicator light was too small to be seen under the harsh hospital fluorescence, but Helen knew I never wore jewelry. She knew I owned nothing like it. Her eyes narrowed. The mask of the grieving, heartbroken mother slipped for a fraction of a second, exposing the cold, calculating panic operating underneath. She did not know what the necklace was, but her instincts told her it was a threat. She reached out again, her fingers hooking into tight claws aimed directly at my throat. "You cannot wear jewelry on the ward," she said. Her voice dropped the tearful tremor and took on a sharp, commanding edge. "It is a choking hazard. Give me the necklace right now, Nina. Let Mom hold it for you to keep you safe." She lunged forward, closing the distance in a sudden burst of speed. Her nails scraped the skin of my collarbone as her fingers hooked around the silver chain. I did not shout. I did not shrink away. I brought my cuffed hands up in a short, hard, defensive motion and swatted her wrist away. The metal links of the handcuffs rattled sharply against her knuckles. The physical impact broke her grip on the chain. She stumbled backward, her heel catching on the linoleum tiles. It was a simple block, nothing more. But Helen had exactly what she wanted. She let out a piercing, theatrical shriek that echoed off the high ceiling of the waiting room. She clutched her wrist against her chest, her face contorting into a mask of simulated agony. She dropped to her knees, right in the middle of the triage floor.
Look at her!
Helen screamed, pointing a trembling finger at my face.
She attacked me! I told you she was violent. She is out of her mind. Somebody sedate her before she kills someone!
The waiting room froze. The security guard unclipped his radio from his belt, taking a step forward. The triage nurse reached under the desk, her hand hovering over the emergency panic button. Richard stood immobilized by the vending machines, watching in silence as his wife orchestrated my destruction. The isolation room was a windowless square measuring 10 feet by 10 feet. The walls were painted a pale institutional green. The only piece of furniture was a molded plastic chair bolted directly to the linoleum floor. The heavy steel door featured a narrow rectangle of reinforced safety glass. I sat on the plastic chair and watched the emergency room function through that glass pane. My hands were still cuffed in front of me, the metal rings dug into my wrists. I kept my breathing slow and even. Through the glass, I had a clear view of the central intake desk. Helen was standing right in front of it. She had cornered a young emergency room physician wearing blue scrubs and a white coat. My mother was leaning across the high counter, invading his personal space. She held a new stack of papers in her right hand. Even through the soundproof door, I could read her body language. She was pushing for the emergency medical conservatorship. She tapped the papers with her index finger, then pressed a tissue to her cheek, playing the exhausted caregiver forced to make a tragic decision for her sick child. Richard stood 3 paces behind her. He kept his hands in his pockets and watched the sliding entrance doors. Those doors hissed open. Julian walked into the triage area. He wore a tailored charcoal suit and a crisp white shirt without a tie. He carried a slim leather briefcase in his left hand. He moved with a measured, deliberate stride that commanded immediate attention. Walking beside him was an older gentleman in a tweed jacket carrying a leather medical folio. Helen spotted Julian instantly. The weeping mother routine vanished. Her shoulders snapped back, her jaw locked. She shoved the conservatorship papers into her purse and marched across the waiting area to intercept him. She planted herself directly in his path, forcing him to stop. She was a foot shorter than Julian, but she tilted her chin up, her face flushing a deep, angry red. "You have no right to be here," Helen said. Her voice carried across the room, sharp and venomous. "This is a private family matter. You are not blood. You need to leave right now and let us take care of our own." Julian did not raise his voice. He did not break eye contact. He simply stepped around her as if she were a misplaced piece of furniture. Helen grabbed his forearm. Her fingernails dug into the sleeve of his suit. "Do not ignore me," she hissed. "You have no authority here. Stay out of white family business." The waiting room went dead quiet. The triage nurse stopped typing. The security guard placed his hand on his radio. Richard finally took his hands out of his pockets, looking around the room in sudden panic. Julian looked down at the hand gripping his arm. He let the silence stretch for 3 full seconds. Then he looked back up at her face. "Let go of my jacket, Helen." He spoke with such icy authority that her fingers uncurled automatically. She stumbled back half a step. Julian adjusted his sleeve and walked straight to the intake desk. The older gentleman in the tweed jacket followed him. Julian set his briefcase on the counter. The brass clasps clicked open. He reached inside and pulled out a thick document bound with a blue legal cover. A raised notary seal was stamped on the bottom corner. He slid the document across the counter until it rested directly under the triage nurse's keyboard. "My name is Julian," he said to the nurse. "I hold full medical power of attorney for the patient in the isolation room, Nina Townsend. That document was executed and notarized 3 weeks ago. It grants me exclusive legal authority to make all medical decisions on her behalf. Furthermore, it explicitly revokes any medical proxy or visitation rights from Helen and Richard Townsend." The nurse looked down at the document, scanning the signatures and the embossed seal. Helen rushed up to the desk, her face pale. "That is a lie," she stammered. "She was not in her right mind when she signed that." "We are her parents. We are pursuing an emergency conservatorship today." The young emergency room physician stepped forward and picked up the power of attorney document. He flipped through the pages, examining the legal clauses. He looked at Julian, then at Helen. "Ma'am," he said, "this is a legally binding directive. Unless you have a judge's order overturning this specific document right now, you have no legal standing to request a conservatorship or receive any medical updates regarding the patient." Helen stood frozen, her mouth open but no sound came out. The trap she had spent weeks building was dismantled in less than 60 seconds by a piece of paper she never knew existed. Richard approached the desk and put a hand on her shoulder, trying to pull her away, but she shook him off. Julian turned his attention to the young emergency room physician. "Doctor, as her legal proxy, I am formally requesting a joint assessment. This is Dr. Sterling, a board-certified psychiatrist. I want him present for the evaluation to provide an immediate secondary consult." Dr. Sterling placed his medical identification card on the counter. "I'm fully licensed in this state, doctor. I would appreciate the professional courtesy of consulting on this 1013 hold." The ER physician reviewed the ID, recognizing he was dealing with a legally binding proxy and a senior colleague. "All right, we will do the evaluation together." The physician grabbed a set of keys from his pocket and walked across the floor toward my room, Dr. Sterling falling in step beside him. Helen tried to follow, but the security guard stepped into her path, holding up a flat palm. "You need to stay in the waiting area, ma'am," the guard instructed. The heavy steel door clicked and swung open. Both doctors stepped into the isolation room, pulling the door shut behind them. Dr. Sterling set his leather folio on his lap, while the ER attending stood near the wall, clipboard in hand. "Good evening, Mina," Dr. Sterling said, keeping his voice calm and professional. "Julian briefed me. The attending physician and I are going to ask you a few standard questions." I nodded. The handcuffs still restricted my movement, so I kept my hands resting on my knees. "I'm ready." The evaluation lasted exactly 15 minutes. He did not ask me about my childhood or my relationship with my mother. He performed a rigorous clinical assessment of my cognitive function. He asked me to recite the date, the day of the week, and my current location. He asked me to count backward from 100 by sevens. He gave me 3 random words to remember and asked me to repeat them 10 minutes later. He asked me to describe the events leading up to the police arriving at my house. I answered every question with cold, measured precision. I maintained steady eye contact. I kept my posture relaxed. I detailed the credit card statements, the casino debt, and the fake psychiatric hold signed by the country club doctor. Sterling wrote continuous notes in his folio. When the 15 minutes were up, he capped his pen. He stood up and knocked twice on the glass pane. The nurse unlocked the door from the outside. Sterling stepped into the hallway. I followed right behind him. Helen was still standing near the desk. She looked exhausted, her posture slumping under the harsh fluorescent lights. Richard was pacing near the vending machines. Julian stood perfectly still, watching the door. The 2 police officers had moved closer to the desk, waiting for the medical verdict to determine their next legal steps. Both doctors stepped out into the hallway. Dr. Sterling handed his written notes to the ER physician. They approached the intake desk where the lead police officer was waiting. Dr. Sterling did not speak first. He deferred to the attending physician, respecting the strict hierarchy of the emergency room. The patient is fully oriented to person, place, and time, the ER physician announced to the officer, his voice carrying across the quiet intake floor. After a joint evaluation with Dr. Sterling, we found normal speech patterns, logical thought progression, and 0 clinical indicators of mania or psychosis. She does not meet any criteria for an involuntary hold. Helen gasped, stepping forward. "You talked to her for 15 minutes! She is manipulating both of you. She needs to be sedated." Dr. Sterling turned his head and looked at my mother with absolute professional disdain. "Ma'am, I've been practicing psychiatry for 30 years. Your daughter is perfectly sane. The medical certificate provided by your family physician is clinically baseless and frankly borders on malpractice." The ER physician nodded in firm agreement, officially taking control of the scene. He looked directly at the lead police officer. "The hospital is officially invalidating the 1013 order. As the attending physician, I am discharging her. You can remove her restraints." The lead police officer exhaled a long breath. He reached for his radio, murmuring a code to dispatch to clear the medical call. Then he turned to me. He unclipped the key from his duty belt and walked over. "Hold out your wrists," he said. I raised my hands. The key slid into the lock. The metal jaws clicked open and fell away, leaving faint red indentations on my skin. I rubbed my wrists, feeling the blood flow back into my fingertips. The physical restraint was gone. The medical narrative was broken. The power dynamic in the room had irreversibly shifted. Helen stared at the empty handcuffs dangling from the officer's fingers. She realized she had played her final card and lost. She had brought the police. She had brought me to the hospital. She had set the stage for her own destruction. I looked past her, catching Julian's eye. He gave me a single, slow nod. The defensive phase of the night was over. It was time to hand them the shovel they had brought to bury me. The heavy steel door of the isolation room clicked shut behind me. I stood in the center of the triage hallway, rubbing the faint red indentations circling my wrists. The physical weight of the handcuffs was gone, but the air in the emergency room remained thick, charged with the sudden reversal of power. Dr. Sterling stood near the intake desk, his leather folio tucked neatly under his arm. He had delivered his clinical verdict with the precision of a scalpel, cutting away the elaborate fiction my mother had spent the entire evening constructing. Helen did not accept defeat gracefully. Her carefully maintained posture crumbled. She lunged toward the counter, her hands slapping flat against the laminated surface. Her voice lost its practiced southern softness, rising into a shrill, desperate pitch that echoed off the tiled walls. "He is lying," Helen shouted, pointing a trembling finger at Dr. Sterling. "He is on their payroll. Julian brought him here to say that. My daughter is a danger to herself. She needs to be sedated right now." The triage nurse pushed her chair back, creating distance between herself and my mother. The security guard stepped off the wall, his hand resting casually on his utility belt. He did not move toward me. He moved toward Helen. "Ma'am," the security guard said, keeping his voice low and firm. "I need you to lower your voice and step away from the desk." Helen ignored him. She turned her frantic gaze to the lead police officer. The older man was holding the forged medical directive in his hand. He looked at the paper, then looked at Dr. Sterling, a board-certified physician standing in a hospital wearing a calm, unimpressed expression. The officer folded the document slowly, creasing it down the middle, and shoved it into his vest pocket. The gesture was final. He was done playing his part in her production. "Officer, you cannot let her leave," Helen pleaded. She stepped toward him, reaching out as if to grab his uniform. "She is sick. She belongs in a ward." The officer held up a flat palm, stopping her in her tracks. "Mrs. Holloway, the attending psychiatrist has cleared the patient. The medical hold is invalid. This is no longer a law enforcement matter. We are done here." He turned away from her and pulled a small notepad from his breast pocket, preparing to write his final incident report to clear the call. The younger officer stepped back, relaxing his stance. The medical emergency was officially over. It was time to introduce the actual emergency. I walked up to the intake desk. The triage nurse watched me approach, her eyes wide, still processing the whiplash of the last 10 minutes. "Excuse me," I said to the nurse. When I was brought in, the paramedics logged a plastic belongings bag with my personal items. I need it back. The nurse nodded quickly. She reached under the counter and retrieved a clear plastic drawstring bag. Inside sat my wallet, my house keys, and my phone. She slid the bag across the counter. I pulled the strings apart and took out my phone. The screen lit up in my hand. I looked down the length of the counter. Sitting next to a stack of clipboard forms and a bottle of hand sanitizer was a small, cylindrical Bluetooth speaker. The nurses likely used it to play low-volume radio during the quiet hours of the night shift. It was powered on, a tiny blue indicator light pulsing steadily on its base. I tapped the settings icon on my screen. I opened the Bluetooth menu. The hospital speaker appeared on my available devices list. I pressed connect. A sharp two-tone chime rang out from the cylinder, signaling a successful pairing. The sound drew the attention of everyone in the immediate vicinity. Helen stopped her frantic breathing. Richard, still lingering near the vending machines, looked up. Julian stood a few feet away, his hands resting easily at his sides, his face an unreadable mask. I turned to face the lead police officer. He had his pen poised over his notepad, ready to write the concluding sentence of his shift. "Officer," I said. My voice carried none of the hysteria my mother had weaponized. It was flat, measured, and entirely lucid. "You received a 911 call tonight reporting a violent psychiatric episode. You want to know the real reason my mother tried to lock me in a mental health facility?" The officer stopped writing. He did not answer, but he did not look away. The pen hovered motionless above the paper. Helen realized what was happening. Her eyes darted from my face to the phone in my hand, then to the silver teardrop pendant resting against my collarbone. The memory of our confrontation the previous night, the words exchanged in the privacy of my living room caught up to her. The blood drained from her face, leaving her skin an ashen, sickly gray. "Nina, do not do this," Helen whispered. It was not a command. It was a plea. I did not look at her. I kept my eyes locked on the police officer. I opened the audio application on my phone. The file I had extracted from the pendant earlier that afternoon sat at the top of the list. I pressed my thumb against the play button. I turned the media volume on my phone all the way up to maximum. The audio file engaged. The low hum of background static hissed through the hospital speaker, followed immediately by my mother's voice. The recording was pristine. It captured the exact acoustic signature of my living room, stripped of all the tears, the fake panic, and the southern charm she used for an audience. The voice echoing through the emergency room was cold, sharp, and venomous. "If you call the cops about those 5 credit cards I opened in your name to pay off your father's debt," the recorded Helen snapped, "I will tell them you stopped taking your medication." The audio filled the sterile hallway. The triage nurse froze. The security guard tilted his head, his eyes narrowing as the words registered. "I have your medical records from when you were 16, the recorded voice continued, dripping with calculated malice. "Who is going to believe a crazy girl, Nina? I gave birth to you. Your assets belong to me." The file ended. The speaker hissed for a fraction of a second before dropping back into silence. The silence that followed was heavy. It was a suffocating, physical weight pressing down on the room. You could hear the faint mechanical hum of the central air conditioning unit pushing cold air through the overhead vents. You could hear the squeak of a rubber shoe shifting on the linoleum down the hall. No one spoke. The performance was dead. The curtain had fallen and the machinery operating behind it was exposed under the harsh fluorescent lights of the emergency ward. The lead police officer stared at the small black speaker on the counter. Then, very slowly, he turned his head to look at Helen. The look of sympathetic patience he had offered her on my front lawn was gone. His jaw muscles clenched, the lines around his eyes hardened. Law enforcement officers deal with lies every single day. But they hold a specific, profound disdain for civilians who use the 911 dispatch system and the threat of involuntary commitment as tools for extortion. Helen opened her mouth. Her lips parted, but her throat refused to produce a sound. She looked around the room, searching for a sympathetic face, searching for a gap in the logic she could exploit. She found nothing. The nurses stared at her with open disgust. Dr. Sterling adjusted his glasses, his expression radiating pure professional contempt. She turned to Richard. "Do something," she mouthed, the words barely a rasp. Richard took half a step backward, pressing his spine against the glass of the vending machine. He looked at his wife like she was a stranger holding a live grenade. The man who had spent 3 decades enabling her cruelty through his silence finally found the limit of his devotion. Julian stepped forward. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick manila folder. He set it on the counter, right next to the Bluetooth speaker. "Officer," Julian said, his voice smooth and steady. "Inside that folder, you will find the printed statements for 5 separate credit accounts opened fraudulently under Nina Townsend's Social Security number over the past 60 days. The total unauthorized debt exceeds $45,000. You will also find the IP address logs provided by the issuing banks, confirming the applications were submitted from the router located inside the Holloway residence." The officer looked at the folder. He clicked his pen shut and slid it into his pocket. He reached up and keyed the microphone attached to his shoulder epaulette. "Dispatch, Unit 4, the officer said. His voice was clipped and authoritative. "Cancel the medical transport report. I need a supervisor and a fraud unit detective routed to General Hospital, main intake. We have a confirmed felony identity theft and a false report of an emergency." "Copy that, Unit 4, the radio crackled back. "Detectives en route." The officer dropped his hand from the radio. He turned his body, squaring his shoulders directly toward my mother. The space between them ceased to be a hospital waiting area. It was now a crime scene. "Mrs. Holloway," the officer said, "step away from the exit. You and your husband are not leaving this building." The command for a fraud unit detective hung in the sterile air of the emergency room intake bay. The lead police officer lowered his hand from his shoulder radio and adjusted his duty belt. He shifted his weight, widening his stance, effectively blocking the automatic sliding doors that led out to the parking lot. The younger officer mirrored his movement, taking a strategic step to the left, boxing my parents into the center of the waiting area. The psychological architecture of my family collapsed right there on the linoleum floor. For 3 decades, Richard Holloway had purchased his peace by serving as a human shield for his wife. He had absorbed her cruelty, validated her lies, and looked the other way while she dismantled my independence. He had played the silent, suffering patriarch, convincing himself that his inaction was a form of keeping the family together. But facing the barrel of a federal fraud investigation, the illusion of his devotion evaporated. Self-preservation kicked in, sharp and immediate. Richard peeled his spine off the glass front of the vending machine. He pulled his hands out of his denim jacket pockets and raised them to shoulder height, palms facing the police officers. His face was slick with a sudden, terrified sweat. "Wait," Richard said. His voice cracked, high and reedy, devoid of any authority. "You need to wait a minute. I did not do this. I did not make that phone call to dispatch tonight. I did not open those accounts." Helen turned her head so fast her neck popped. She stared at the man she had controlled since the 1980s. The shock on her face was genuine. She had spent the entire evening orchestrating a masterful performance of maternal grief, expecting him to play his assigned role as the grieving father. She never anticipated that the extra she had cast in her production would go off script. Richard took another step backward, putting physical distance between himself and his wife. He kept his hands raised, addressing the lead officer directly, speaking rapidly as if the words could build a wall around him. "I did not sign those credit applications," Richard stammered. "I did not log into those banking websites. She keeps Nina's original Social Security card in a metal lockbox in her home office. I do not even have the key to it. She did this on her own. She forced me to go along with the hospital plan tonight. She told me if I did not back her up about the knife, she would leave me. I am a victim here too." Helen let out a sound that did not belong in a hospital. It was a guttural, feral noise, the sound of a cornered animal realizing the trap was shut. The pristine country club matriarch vanished completely, her face contorted into an ugly, asymmetrical snarl. "You spineless coward," Helen hissed. She lunged toward him, her hands curling into tight fists at her sides. You stand there and try to blame me. You stand there and play the innocent husband. Richard flinched, shrinking back against the wall, but Helen did not stop. The fury of his betrayal overrode any lingering sense of self-preservation she had left. She did not care that 2 police officers were watching her. She did not care that a security guard had his hand resting on his radio. She only cared about destroying the man who had just abandoned her. Who lost $45,000 in 4 days? Helen demanded, her voice echoing off the high ceiling.
Who sat at our kitchen table weeping into his hands because the men from the underground poker games were threatening to come to our house?
You begged me to fix it. You handed me her social security number and told me to figure it out before they broke your legs. Do not dare stand in front of these people and pretend your hands are clean. You spent every dime of that money at the Bellagio and the Mirage. The lead police officer pulled his notepad back out. He did not interrupt her. He simply started writing. Law enforcement officers rarely have to work hard to extract a confession when co-conspirators turn on each other. The anger does the interrogating for them. Ma'am, the officer said, his voice deceptively calm. Are you stating for the record that you utilized your daughter's social security number to open credit accounts in order to pay off your husband's gambling debts? Helen froze. The echo of her own words caught up to her. Her chest heaved as she dragged in a sharp breath. She looked at the officer, then at the notepad in his hand, realizing she had just delivered a verbal confession to identity theft simply to win an argument with her husband. The realization hit her with physical force. Her knees buckled slightly, and she grabbed the back of a plastic waiting room chair to keep herself upright. She closed her mouth and stared at the floor, the fight draining out of her, replaced by a cold, suffocating panic. Julian broke the silence. He stepped up to the intake counter, moving with the measured, deliberate pace of a man who dealt in facts, data, and ruin. He did not look at Helen. He did not look at Richard. He addressed the police officer, treating the situation like a corporate audit. Officer Julian said, his rich baritone grounding the chaotic energy of the room. The folder I placed on the counter contains the preliminary forensic financial data. Because the fraudulent accounts were opened in Nina's name, she authorized me to log into the customer portals to extract the device history. The officer stepped over to the counter and opened the manila folder. Inside, you will find 5 separate credit profiles, Julian explained, keeping his hands clasped behind his back. Chase Sapphire, American Express Platinum, Discover It, and 2 Capital One signature cards. All 5 applications were submitted online within a 48-hour window exactly 3 weeks ago. The officer flipped the first page, his eyes scanning the highlighted sections Julian had meticulously prepared. Notice the digital footprint on page 3, Julian continued, his tone surgical and precise. Every single application was routed through the same IP address. I ran a diagnostic trace on that IP. It resolves directly to the Internet Service Provider account registered to Gerald Richard Holloway at their home address. The applications were filled out using a tablet connected to their private home network. Richard squeezed his eyes shut. He pressed the heels of his hands against his temples, shaking his head back and forth as the digital paper trail buried him alive. Furthermore, Julian said, gesturing to a secondary stack of papers in the back of the folder, you will find the transaction logs for the $45,000. The funds were not withdrawn as cash in this state. The American Express and Chase accounts were used to purchase high-yield casino markers and cover luxury hotel accommodations in Las Vegas, Nevada. Attached to those transaction logs is an electronic flight receipt from Delta Airlines. I recovered it from the secondary email account used to set up these credit profiles. It confirms that Gerald Richard Holloway booked a direct flight from Atlanta to Las Vegas on the exact dates the charges were initiated. Julian stepped back from the counter, aligning himself shoulder to shoulder with me. He looked at the officer, delivering the final, irrefutable conclusion. Helen Holloway committed the digital fraud from her living room. Julian stated. Richard Holloway executed the spending across state lines. It is a coordinated, interstate financial crime executed to defraud my sister-in-law, followed immediately by an attempt to strip her of her legal autonomy through a false psychiatric hold to prevent her from reporting it. The triage nurse behind a desk had stopped pretending to work. She was staring at my parents with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. Dr. Sterling, the private psychiatrist, slowly shook his head, adjusted his tweed jacket, and stepped back into the hallway, distancing himself from the toxic fallout of the Holloway family. The lead officer closed the manila folder. He tapped his pen against the laminated counter twice. He looked at Richard, shivering against the vending machine, and then at Helen, gripping the plastic chair like it was a life raft. "Mr. and Mrs. Holloway," the officer said. His voice was no longer conversational. It was the hard, flat tone of the state. "Based on the audio recording provided by your daughter, your own verbal statements made in this room, and the financial documentation presented here, I have more than enough probable cause to detain you both." Helen opened her mouth to speak, perhaps to try one last desperate lie, one last tearful manipulation. "Do not say another word," the officer commanded, cutting her off instantly. "You are currently subjects of an active felony investigation. The fraud unit detectives are 5 minutes away. You will sit in those 2 chairs against the far wall. You will keep your hands visible. You will not speak to each other, and you will not look at your daughter. If either of you attempts to walk toward those sliding doors, you will be placed in handcuffs immediately. Do you understand these instructions?" Richard nodded silently, his face aimed at the floor. He shuffled over to the designated chairs and sat down, a hollowed-out shell of a man. Helen stood frozen for a moment. She looked at me. It was a long, terrible look. It contained no apology, no remorse, and no maternal warmth. It was the look of an architect watching her masterpiece burn to the ground, furious at the fire for not obeying her design. "Sit down, Mrs. Holloway," the younger officer ordered, resting his hand on his duty belt. Helen turned around. She walked to the plastic chair next to her husband. She sat down, crossed her ankles, and stared straight ahead at the blank white wall of the emergency room. The toxic triangle was dead. The puppet master had lost her strings, the enabler had lost his shield, and the scapegoat had finally walked out of the slaughterhouse. I stood next to Julian, breathing the sterile hospital air, waiting for the final piece of the family to arrive and make her choice. The automatic sliding doors of the emergency room hissed open, letting in a brief gust of the chilled night air. My sister Chloe rushed onto the intake floor. She was wearing a silk emerald wrap dress and silver heels, her hair pinned up for a charity gala she and Julian had been attending across town, before my emergency call disrupted their evening. The expensive fabric of her dress rustled sharply against the sterile quiet of the hospital ward, making her look entirely out of place in a room smelling of industrial bleach and institutional coffee. Chloe had always been the golden child of the Holloway family. She was the daughter who followed the rules, the one who navigated our mother's volatile moods by offering total compliance. For 27 years, Chloe had operated as the family peacekeeper, continually advising me to just apologize, to just compromise, to simply nod and agree, because keeping Helen happy was the only way any of us survived. She stopped in the center of the triage area, her chest heaving. Her eyes darted over the scene, taking in the security guard, the 2 police officers, and finally, our parents sitting in the molded plastic chairs reserved for detainees. Helen did not wait for permission to move. She defied the officer's previous command and sprang up from her chair. She launched herself across the linoleum floor before the younger officer could intercept her. She threw her arms around Chloe's neck, burying her face into the shoulder of the emerald silk dress. It was a masterclass in physical manipulation. Helen clung to her eldest daughter like a shipwrecked survivor clinging to driftwood, her shoulders shaking with loud theatrical sobs.
"Oh, thank God you were here,"
Helen cried, her voice muffled against Chloe's neck.
"Thank God someone sensible is here. You have to fix this, Chloe. You have to stop them."
Chloe instinctively wrapped her arms around our mother, her conditioning kicking in immediately. She stroked Helen's hair, her eyes wide with panic as she looked over her mother's shoulder at Julian and me. "What is going on?" Chloe demanded, her voice tight with anxiety. "Julian, why are my parents sitting under police guard? Why is Nina standing there looking like nothing is wrong? Mom called me from the ambulance saying Nina had a psychotic break." Helen pulled back just enough to look at Chloe's face. She kept her hands gripping her daughter's forearms, ensuring a physical anchor. "It was a lie," Helen gasped, tears streaming through her ruined makeup. "Nina orchestrated this whole thing. She is trying to frame your father and me for some credit card mix-up. She brought a private doctor here to lie to the police, and now Julian is telling the officers to arrest us. You have to talk some sense into your husband. Tell him to drop these ridiculous charges right now." Chloe turned her gaze to me. The familiar dynamic settled over her features. The desperate, pleading look of a sister begging me to just absorb the damage so the family could go back to pretending everything was fine. "Nina," Chloe said, adopting that soothing, patronizing tone she always used when she needed me to surrender. "Whatever this financial issue is, we can sort it out privately. We do not need law enforcement." "You are scaring Mom and Dad. Please, just tell the officers it is a misunderstanding. We can hire an accountant tomorrow. Just drop the complaint so we can all go home." I did not cross the room. I did not raise my voice. I stood my ground next to the triage desk. "There is no misunderstanding, Chloe," I said. I kept my words clipped and distinct. "They did not make a financial error. They stole my Social Security number, opened $45,000 in casino debt, and then tried to lock me in a psychiatric ward so I could not report the fraud." "That is a delusion!" Helen shrieked, tightening her grip on Chloe's arms. "She is making it up. Tell her, Richard. Tell your daughter she is sick." Richard did not look up from the floor. He kept his hands folded between his knees, entirely checked out of the reality his wife was currently fighting to alter. Chloe looked at her husband. She trusted Julian more than anyone else in the world, but the gravitational pull of our mother's manufactured grief was strong. "Julian," Chloe pleaded, stepping slightly away from Helen, "tell me what is actually happening." Julian did not offer emotional comfort. He did not offer opinions. He picked up the manila folder from the counter and walked the short distance to his wife. He held the folder out to her. "Read the first 3 pages," Julian instructed. His voice was rich, steady, and devoid of judgment. "It is the digital trail from 5 banking institutions. The applications trace back to the router in your parents' living room. The spending traces to your father's location in Nevada." "They committed a federal crime, Chloe." Chloe took the folder. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the cover. She scanned the highlighted lines, the IP addresses, the dates, the staggering sum of the stolen money. She read the data prepared by the man she married, a man whose entire career was built on factual accuracy. "But," Chloe started, her voice wavering as her mind fought to find a loophole in the evidence. "Maybe someone hacked their network. Maybe Dad clicked a bad link. Mom would never intentionally do something like this to Nina. She just wants us to be a close family." Helen seized the opening. "Yes," Helen cried, stepping forward to touch Chloe's shoulder again. "We were hacked. That is exactly what happened. Julian is just using this as an excuse to tear our family apart because he has always hated us. He is manipulating you, sweetheart." Julian watched his wife struggle. He saw the exact moment her logic crashed into 3 decades of emotional conditioning. He knew reading bank statements would not be enough to break the spell Helen held over her golden child. Chloe needed to hear the malice. She needed to hear the poison hiding beneath the southern charm. Julian reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He had already requested the audio file from me while I was in the isolation room. He connected his device to the hospital's Bluetooth speaker, still sitting on the intake counter. "Chloe," Julian said, holding her gaze. "I need you to listen to this very carefully." He pressed play. The emergency room filled once again with the crisp, unfiltered acoustic environment of my living room from the previous night. It started playing the final 10 seconds of the recording, the portion I had not played for the police officer. Helen's voice echoed out of the small speaker, stripped of all tears, stripped of all maternal warmth. It was a cold, calculating sneer. "Once I get Nina declared unfit and gain control of those accounts, I am fixing the other problem in this family." The recorded Helen stated, "I am cutting Chloe out of that will until she wakes up and divorces that arrogant black husband of hers." I will not have my grandchildren raised by a man who looks down on us. I will starve her out financially until she signs the papers." The recording clicked off. The silence that followed was total. It was a heavy, suffocating vacuum. The hospital staff, the security guard, the 2 police officers, everyone stood frozen, witnessing the absolute decimation of a mother-daughter bond. Helen's hands dropped from Chloe's dress. She stumbled backward, her mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled onto dry land. The color vanished from her face, leaving her foundation looking like a pale mask painted over a corpse. She reached out again, her fingers shaking in the cold air. "Chloe, baby," Helen whispered, her voice a desperate, raspy croak. "I was just angry. I did not mean it. You know I love you. You know I love your family." Chloe did not move, but the air seemed to leave her lungs all at once. A short, strangled gasp escaped her throat. The frantic, anxious energy that had propelled her into the hospital collapsed inward. For 27 years, her entire identity had been built on being the perfect daughter, the peacemaker, the one who earned Helen's love through absolute obedience. Watching that illusion burn to the ground was not instantaneous. It was a physical agony. She swayed slightly on her silver heels, raising a trembling hand to her mouth. Tears welled in her eyes, not tears of grief, but the hot, stinging tears of profound humiliation and betrayal. Helen saw the tears and took a hopeful step forward, reaching out again. "Chloe, please." Chloe flinched. It was a violent, involuntary shudder, pulling her shoulders back as if her mother's outstretched hand was coated in acid. That single physical flinch was the death of the golden child. She looked at the trembling woman standing in front of her, finally seeing the malice hiding beneath the cashmere. Then, slowly, she turned her head and looked at Julian. Her husband stood tall, his posture relaxed, offering her the silent, unwavering support he had provided since the day they met. He did not ask her to choose. He simply provided the truth and waited for her to process the shock. Chloe wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing her expensive mascara, erasing the perfect daughter forever. She closed the manila folder. The sharp snap of the heavy paper echoed in the quiet room. She handed the documents back to Julian. When she looked back at our mother, the tears were gone, replaced by a chilling, absolute clarity. "Julian," Chloe said. Her voice shook for a fraction of a second before dropping into an octave as flat and clinical as my own. "Call the retention firm. Get your lawyers on the line, tonight." Helen let out a strangled gasp. "Chloe, please. You have to help us post bail. We cannot go to jail. We are your parents." Chloe turned her face back to Helen. She looked her mother up and down, taking in the ruined makeup, the wrinkled cardigan, the sheer, pathetic desperation of a manipulator who had run out of victims. "You are not my mother," Chloe stated. "You are a financial liability, and I am not authorizing a single cent of our accounts to bond you out of a federal holding cell." Helen screamed. It was not a performative cry. It was a raw, visceral shriek of genuine terror. She threw herself forward, trying to grab Chloe's arm, trying to force her back into submission through sheer physical contact. The younger police officer moved instantly. He stepped between them, putting a heavy hand squarely in the center of Helen's chest, shoving her backward toward the plastic chairs. "Sit down and put your hands behind your back." The officer barked, drawing his handcuffs. "You were warned about moving." Chloe did not flinch as the metal cuffs ratcheted around her mother's wrists. She did not look back at Richard, who was now weeping silently into his hands. She turned her back on the wreckage of our family. She walked across the linoleum floor, her heels clicking a steady, rhythmic beat. She stopped when she reached my side. She reached out and took my hand, lacing her fingers tightly through mine. As her fingers locked with mine, I felt my chest flutter for a single heartbeat. My plan was perfect, but deep down, there was a 10-year-old child who had just officially lost her parents. I swallowed the bitter lump in my throat, squeezed her hand back, and locked the pain away. We stood shoulder to shoulder, presenting a united, unbreakable front, watching the officers process the people who had spent their entire lives trying to tear us apart. The wait lasted less than 10 minutes. The heavy automatic doors of the emergency room slid open, breaking the stagnant air with a rush of cold wind. 2 men in plain clothes stepped onto the intake floor. They wore dark windbreakers over collared shirts. Gold shields hung from thick chains around their necks. They moved with a synchronized, unhurried, heavy step that immediately identified them as fraud unit detectives. The lead patrol officer met them halfway across the linoleum. He handed over the manila folder Julian had provided. He pointed to the small Bluetooth speaker still sitting on the triage counter. The older detective flipped open the folder. His eyes scanned the highlighted IP addresses, the bank statements, the timeline of the casino markers. He nodded once, a sharp, decisive dip of his chin. He handed the folder back, adjusted his belt, and turned his attention to the far wall. Helen and Richard sat in the molded plastic chairs. They looked like strangers occupying the same waiting area. Richard had his elbows resting on his knees, his face buried in his palms. Helen sat rigid, her back straight, her hands gripping the edges of her seat until her knuckles turned a mottled yellow. The 2 detectives crossed the room, flanked by the uniformed patrol officers. The footprint of authority closed in around my parents. Gerald Richard Holloway, the older detective said. His voice was a flat industrial instrument. Stand up, turn around, place your hands flat against the wall. Richard did not argue. He did not ask for a lawyer. The psychological collapse that had begun minutes earlier was now complete. He pushed himself up from the chair. His knees shook, causing his denim jacket to tremble. He turned his back to the room. He raised his arms and pressed his palms against the pale green paint. The younger patrol officer stepped in. He unclipped the steel restraints from his belt. The heavy ratcheting sound of the metal teeth clicking into place echoed off the high ceiling. It was the exact same sound I had heard in my childhood bedroom an hour ago, but this time, the steel was not meant for me. Richard lowered his head until his forehead touched the drywall, accepting the physical reality of his choices. Helen Holloway, the detective said, shifting his focus to the woman sitting frozen in the plastic chair. Stand up. Helen did not move. Her eyes darted from the detective to the uniformed officers, then to the triage desk. She was searching for an audience, searching for a sympathetic face she could manipulate. She found nothing.
You are making a mistake,
Helen said. Her voice climbed, thin and frantic, stripping away the last remnants of her polished country club exterior.
I am a mother. I am a respected member of my church. You cannot treat me like a criminal in front of these people.
The detective did not engage with her narrative. He did not debate her social standing. Stand up, ma'am, or we will assist you in standing up. Helen crossed her arms over her chest, digging her heels into the floor. She lifted her chin in a final, pathetic display of manufactured defiance. The detective stepped forward. He reached down, gripped her upper arm, and hauled her to her feet in one fluid, uncompromising motion. The physical contact shattered the delusion. Helen realized the performance was over. There were no more lines to deliver. There was only the inevitable progression of the law. She began to fight. It was not a graceful resistance. It was an ugly, desperate thrashing. She twisted her shoulders, trying to wrench her arm out of the detective's grip. Her heel kicked backward, striking the plastic chair and sending it skidding across the linoleum with a loud screech. Her carefully arranged hair fell loose from its pins, hanging in damp, tangled strands across her face. The pristine cream cardigan slipped off one shoulder, exposing the frantic heaving of her chest.
Let go of me!
Helen screamed. She turned her head toward the intake desk, her eyes wide and wild.
Help me! Tell them to stop!
Tell them my daughter is the one who belongs in a cell. The medical staff, the same people who had looked at her with profound pity just an hour earlier, responded with physical revulsion. The triage nurse pushed her rolling chair backward, creating as much distance as possible between herself and the intake counter. She stared at my mother with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. Dr. Sterling, the private psychiatrist, stood near the hallway corridor. He reached up, adjusted his glasses, and shook his head slowly. a silent condemnation of the woman who had tried to weaponize his profession. The officers did not hesitate. The younger patrolman grabbed Helen's other arm. Together, they forced her hands behind her back. She bucked and arched her spine, panting heavily. The metal cuffs snapped shut around her wrists, locking her in place. The struggle ceased the moment the steel tightened. She slumped forward, her breath hitching in her throat, a captive to her own greed. I stood near the triage counter, watching the structure of my childhood burn down to the foundation. I did not feel the need to shout. I did not feel the need to explain myself to the room. The evidence had spoken for me. The authorities had acted for me. My hands were empty, and my pulse was slow and steady. I reached out and picked up the silver teardrop pendant resting next to the Bluetooth speaker. I unclasped the thin chain. I reached behind my neck and fastened the jewelry against my collarbone. The metal was cool against my skin. It felt like a shield. I picked up my dark wool coat from the edge of the counter. I slid my left arm into the sleeve, then my right. I adjusted the lapels, smoothing the fabric over my shoulders. I moved with the deliberate, measured pace of a woman who had nowhere else she was forced to be. I collected my phone and my keys, dropping them into my pockets. The detectives instructed the patrol officers to initiate the transport. The officers gripped my parents by the elbows, turning them toward the automatic sliding doors. Richard walked with a heavy, dragging shuffle. He did not look up. He moved like a ghost being escorted out of the physical world. Helen was pulled forward. Her breathing was ragged, her face flushed and streaked with ruined makeup. The officers marched her across the intake floor, aiming her directly past the spot where I stood. She planted her feet as she drew level with me. The sudden resistance forced the officers to pause for a fraction of a second. Helen turned her head. Her eyes locked onto mine. There was no realization, no maternal regret, no surrender. There was only a cold, venomous hatred. The mask was gone, permanently. "You owe us this life," Helen hissed. Her voice was raw, scraping against the quiet hum of the emergency room. "We made you." I did not step back. I closed the gap, stepping right into the space the officers had cleared. I leaned down, bringing my face inches from hers. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the chill of a frozen lake, letting the words drop like heavy stones. "I owe you nothing," I said. "I am just recovering the life you stole." I straightened my posture and stepped aside. The officers pulled her forward, breaking the connection. Helen stumbled toward the exit, the metal chain between her wrists clinking against her belt line. The sliding glass doors hissed open, swallowing my parents into the flashing red and blue lights of the waiting cruisers. I turned to look at Julian and Chloe. Julian gave a single, firm nod. Chloe stood tall, her arms resting at her sides, her face serene and unbothered by the departure of the woman who gave birth to us. The emotional supply chain was severed. The toxic triangle was dismantled. I turned my back on the intake desk. I walked across the linoleum floor, my boots striking the tiles with a clean, rhythmic sound. The automatic doors parted for me. I stepped out of the hospital. The cold wind hit my face, sharp and clean. The sprawling sky above the parking lot was pitch black, stripped of clouds, vast and unburdened. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the freezing air, and exhaled. I had never felt so light. I had never been so free. 6 months later, the rain in Seattle fell in a steady rhythm against the windows of my new apartment. I stood at the kitchen island, looking at my banking app. My credit score read 812. The $45,000 debt was legally reassigned to the people who actually spent it. A new city, a new title as Director of User Experience, and a slate wiped perfectly clean. The justice system had moved swiftly after that night at the hospital. My father avoided federal prison by testifying for the prosecution and surrendering his house. He is currently serving 36 months of supervised probation, living in a weekly rate motel. My mother did not get a deal. She received 24 months in a federal correctional institution. The toxic triangle was permanently dismantled. I took the elevator down to the lobby to check my mail. Inside my box was a standard white envelope. The return address was stamped in heavy black ink, Federal Correctional Institution, Aliceville, Alabama. Beneath the stamp was my name, written in my mother's sweeping blue cursive. 6 months ago, a letter like this would have derailed my week. I would have braced myself for her venom or her desperate manipulation. Today, I did not even open it. I carried the envelope back upstairs, walked straight into my home office, and flicked on the heavy-duty paper shredder. I held the letter over the feeding slot. I let go. The steel teeth pulverized whatever manipulation she had spent hours drafting into unreadable confetti. I walked over to the living room window, looking out at the Seattle skyline. I took a deep breath of the clean air, enjoying the single most valuable asset I had ever reclaimed: my permanent, unbroken peace. Family is not defined by shared DNA. It is defined by the people who choose to stand beside you when you finally decide to save yourself. You cannot buy peace from abusers through concessions, and you cannot defeat them by arguing. You defeat them by removing your emotion, presenting the cold facts, and enforcing a boundary that you are willing to let burn to the ground. When you finally cut off their emotional supply chain, the quiet that follows the storm is not emptiness. It is the arrival of your own peace. The ultimate victory over someone who tried to break you is simply living a successful, safe, and thoroughly unbothered life without them. Before you move on to the next video, take a moment to reflect on your own life. Have you ever had to walk away from people who only loved the useful version of you? Tell me your story in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe to Sweet Life Drama if you believe that protecting your peace is more important than keeping a toxic family together. You deserve a life where you do not have to fight for your right to exist.